thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm so delighted to be here with two dear colleagues to offer a preview of this exhibit. As Tobias said, the exhibit is in 3 parts, focusing on 3 different individuals, though they share interesting and surprising resonances: Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin, and Ollie Harrington. Each exhibit is drawn from collections dedicated to these respective men that were compiled by Walter O. Evans. I curated the exhibit on Frederick Douglass, and I'll be talking about it in a moment. But first, I wanted to start by saying just a few words about Walter and Linda Evans. And if you could go to the next slide, please. For more than 4 decades, Walter and Linda Evans have fostered and promoted African-American art and literature as collectors, patrons, and educators, now based in Savannah, Georgia. Walter Evans grew up in the segregated Southern United States, and he has said that he only began to visit art museums while stationed in Philadelphia during his service in the Navy. He began collecting art after he was discharged while a college student at Howard University, and his collection is just a staggering who's who of African-American artists. The collection includes works by Romare Bearden, whose collage piano lesson you can see behind the Evanses in this photograph on the screen, Elizabeth Catlett, Elder Corder, Aaron Douglas, Robert Duncanson, Norman Lewis, Marion Perkins, Henry Oswald Tanner, Charles White, James Vander Zee, and many others. Along the way, Walter also began collecting books and manuscripts, including collections of Douglass, Baldwin, and Harrington, which in 2014 and 2020 joined the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection at Beinecke Library. The Evanses have been committed for decades to sharing their collection with a diverse global audience. Frequently hosting and supporting artists and scholars over the years, they convened events for Bearden, Margaret Walker Alexander, the poet, and the Jacob Lawrence Catalog Raisonné project, on whose board Walter served. Linda, an educator, has promoted the creation of guides and curriculum around materials in their collection and managed a robust schedule of loans. The Evans collection has been exhibited widely, including a traveling exhibition of 80 works, which was seen at 45 institutions in a 16-year period that began in 1991. After that exhibition, the Evanses donated a portion of their collection to the Savannah College of Art and Design Museum, also known as the SCAD Museum, and established the Walter and Linda Evans Center for African American Studies at SCAD. The Evanses have also regularly hosted researchers in their home in Savannah, turning their dining room into a veritable reading room. One beneficiary of their hospitality was Yale Sterling professor David Blight, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, is dedicated to the Evanses. We are honored to be the new home of these collections and to share in Walter and Linda Evans' legacy of stewardship of African-American art, literature, and history. Next slide, please. I also want to acknowledge my huge indebtedness to Professor David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass, which draws heavily on the Evans collection, and which, as I said, won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2019. Professor Blight's research guided me to many of the examples now on view. Professor Blight is also the person who introduced the Evanses to me and other colleagues at Beinecke Library, and we are grateful that he did. The photo that you see here is of Walter Evans on the left and David Blight on the right at the Evanses' home in Savannah. And the painting behind them, by the way, is Flight of the Eagle by Robert Duncanson, another renowned African-American landscape painter of the 19th century. Next slide, please. So the Douglass exhibit is titled Frederick Douglass, Family and Legacy. And the through line for this exhibit is how we remember Frederick Douglass and how his legacy was stewarded by his family. I want to note that we are very fortunate to have been able to digitize the Walter O. Evans collection of Frederick Douglass and Douglass family papers in its entirety. And those images are accessible online from anywhere, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The exhibit is showing probably around 75% of the items in the collection, but you can see all of it online anytime. The Douglass exhibit is in 3 parts, and I'm just going to offer an overview of those parts and point to a few highlights right now. Next slide, please. The first section shows a variety of topical highlights from the Evans Douglass collection, which are listed here. The collection is mainly focused on Douglass in the post-war period after the Civil War. The section on his consular service in Haiti, which was in the 1890s, just before his death, is built around these wonderful letters that he wrote to his sons during his tenure there, and then subsequently while he was overseeing the creation of the Haitian Pavilion at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. These letters are really exquisite, and they provide such a window into Douglass's relationships with his sons, even his troubled middle son, Frederick Jr., about whom he complains to his oldest son, Louis, in one of the letters. There is one letter that is on stationery for the Haitian Pavilion and is written to Douglass's youngest son, Charles, who he addresses as "my dear Charlie," with a Y. He complains about the swampy weather in Chicago. He asks Charles to ensure that the winter apples from his estate, Cedar Hill, in Washington, D.C., will be saved so that he can have applesauce over the winter. The detail on the screen is from a letter to Haley, who's Charles's youngest son, Douglass's grandson, and he has signed it, "Your affectionate grandpa, Frederick Douglass." I find that these kinds of documents really humanize Douglass, who is such a lion of a figure. The Douglass family was plagued by tragedy and grief, some of which we kind of get into in the exhibit. In 1860, the Douglasses lost their youngest daughter, the youngest of 5 children, 11-year-old Annie, who was called the twinkle of her father's eye. Her mother's grief, Anna Douglass's grief, endured for decades. And of the 21 children born to Rosetta, Frederick Jr., and Charles Douglass, 3 of Douglass's children, half of those children died before reaching adulthood, 5 in infancy. The eldest Douglass outlived half of his grandchildren and 2 of his children, including his namesake, Frederick Douglass Jr., who died at 50. You can catch small glimpses of how Douglass bore these losses in his correspondence with his sons. Then there's a section on Louis and Charles Douglass military service that focuses on these letters that Louis Douglass wrote to his sweetheart. It's really one of the densest and really richest sources in the whole collection. There are 42 letters from Louis Douglass, who was Douglass's oldest son, to his sweetheart, Amelia Logan. They would eventually be married for 38 years, but they courted for 12 years. And during that time, Louis was writing to Amelia frequently. He addresses her in every letter as "my own dear Amelia," and he underlines every single one of those words. Several of the letters report on Louis's time in the Army. He enlisted at his father's behest in the famous Massachusetts 54th Army Regiment. And his letters detail his training at Camp Meigs in Redville, Massachusetts, and from the battlefront in South Carolina and Georgia, where he encounters Harriet Tubman twice in his travels, the second time after he is wounded in the 54th's famous battle at Fort Wagner by Augustus Saint-Gaudens memorial on Boston Common. Sorry, one moment. My computer went to sleep. Okay, I'm back. Memorial on Boston Common. Louis was injured in combat. He was actually more gravely injured than he led on to either Amelia or his family. An illness from his injuries were what led to his discharge from the Army. Next slide, please. The next section of the exhibit features 9 scrapbooks compiled by 2 of Frederick Douglass's sons, Louis Douglass and Frederick Douglass Jr. And these are really the core of the Evans collection of Douglass family papers. The scrapbooks include newspaper clippings, letters, ephemera, and biographical and genealogical notes covering much of the elder Douglass's life from the end of the Civil War until his death in 1895. The last scrapbook collects obituaries and other remembrances of Douglass after his death. You can learn a lot about Douglass from these compilations, but also about the 2 sons' relationships with their father, and about kooky, Gilded Age pastimes like pedestrianism. And this picture on the screen is of Frank Hart, who was one of the first Black competitors to win big at this sport, which was endurance walking. So they would have these walking races that would last 6 days, and they had to walk in laps at Madison Square Garden. There are touch screens in the exhibit where you can browse all of the pages of all of the scrapbooks on site if you're here. And of course, you can also see them online. Next slide, please. Now on to the final section. Few figures in African-American history loom as large as Frederick Douglass. If you're here, I probably don't need to tell you that. He has been the subject of innumerable biographies. He has been fictionalized in novels. He has been portrayed on stage and in film, in drama, comedy, and opera. After Douglass himself, who wrote 3 autobiographies, Douglass's own children were among the first to determine how he would be remembered. The final section of the exhibit takes off from that idea of Douglass's children remembering him and explores the many ways Douglass has been remembered in Beinecke's collections. And it takes this opportunity to turn to other contributors to the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of African American Arts and Letters. Something I discovered while working on the exhibit is that you can take a group of books by or about Douglass, and you will be able to populate a list of the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection's leading collectors, the Black book collectors Jerome Bowers Peterson and William Pickens, and white collectors of Black literature and history like Arthur Spingarn, Carl Van Vechten, and Randolph Lindsley Simpson. By honoring these collectors, my aim was to pay tribute to Walter Evans's collecting, to credit his foresight in ensuring that these materials are available to us today. So on the screen here, you can see a photograph of Charles Douglass, his son Joseph, the one standing, and Lewis Douglass, which was taken when Douglass died, a Golden Legacy comic book about Douglass, a detail from a first edition of Douglass's autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, annotated by William Pickens, a member of the Yale class of 1904 and an NAACP officer and writer. He has written, quote, "The old boy had righteous wrath that day, a great denunciation." And then there's a souvenir button from the dedication of the memorial to Frederick Douglass in Rochester, and a manuscript draft of Langston Hughes's poem, Frederick Douglass, which Hughes wrote near the end of his life. And he writes, "He died in 1895. He is not dead." I hope those of you who are able will come and see it, and I hope others will be able to engage with this material online. Thank you again for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Thank you, Melissa. I'd like to extend special thanks to my closest collaborators. In addition to my excellent co-curators, Melissa and Kassidi, I'm grateful to our student research assistant, Isabel Priolo, and to our guest contributor, Brittany Livingston. And my deep thanks too to our graphic designer, Megan Mangum. Her work on my part of the exhibition was incredibly valuable to me as I pieced this show together. My exhibition is called Love Jimmy, Letters from James Baldwin to Mary Painter, 1957. It includes some 20 letters and postcards from that year, alongside manuscripts and published essays Baldwin was writing at the same time. Today, I'll share some details about Baldwin's life in 1957 with just a few slides, including quotations from the letters. Next slide, please. When he moved from Greenwich Village to Paris in 1948, James Baldwin met fellow American Mary Garland Painter, who had recently moved to the city as an economist with the Marshall Plan. In the years to follow, Painter would become one of Baldwin's closest friends. The Walter O. Evans collection of James Baldwin, which includes more than 100 letters Baldwin wrote to Painter between 1953 and 1964, makes evident the depth of their friendship. Baldwin confides about struggles with writing, romance, and family. He considers current events, chronicling his increasingly public role in the civil rights movement. His letters are by turns loving and troubled, humorous and searching, joyful and heartbroken. The group on view in the exhibition are a selection from an eventful year during which Baldwin traveled widely, including his first trip to the American South. Next slide, please. In 1957, Baldwin was at work on his third novel, Another Country. Published in 1962, the novel is an ambitious narrative considering the lives and relationships of a group of friends and acquaintances in New York in the 1950s. The novel explores many then provocative subjects: interracial love and friendship, homosexuality and bisexuality, suicide, and adultery. Though it would be a few years before he completed the book, Baldwin already planned to dedicate it to Mary Painter. In his letters to her throughout that year, he often referred to the novel as your book. Early in the year, having retreated from Paris to the Mediterranean island of Corsica, Baldwin wrote to Mary Painter about his daily life, his writing, and his plans for the coming year. He discussed his writing life in all its aspects, from physically sitting at his typewriter with his curious cat pawing the moving keys, to his editor's deadlines and demands. Living by his pen, Baldwin was ever aware of the financial aspects of the professional writer's career. Writing for Hollywood, he noted, quote, "can bring in quite a little change, and a little change, to quote Pearl Bailey, is exactly what I need," end quote. About his progress writing Mary's book, Another Country, he wrote, quote, "I keep looking at your photograph and saying to myself, it's got to be a good book. It's got to be." Through the spring and early summer, Baldwin wrote about his plans to return to the US after an absence of several years, The trip would include his first journey to the American South. Next slide, please. The section of the exhibition, including Baldwin's letters from this trip, is called A Story the Nation is Writing. I co-curated this section of the exhibition with Brittany Livingston, a recent graduate of the doctoral program in African American Studies at Yale. In the fall of 1957, just weeks after President Eisenhower had signed the Civil Rights Act into law, Baldwin traveled to the South, visiting Atlanta, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee, Little Rock, Arkansas, and other cities. Though he understood himself to be an American, quote, native son, he had never been to this part of the country, and he arrived to a region in turmoil. With financial support and article commissions from the Partisan Review and Harper's, Baldwin visited Tuskegee, Alabama, 5 months into a boycott of city stores in protest of policies that effectively barred Black citizens from voting. He later arrived in Montgomery just a year after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott. When he visited Charlotte, North Carolina, school desegregation was just beginning 3 years after the landmark Supreme Court decision Brown versus Board of Education declared school segregation unconstitutional. Baldwin interviewed artists, students, and families about their experiences. He attended church services and mass meetings. He met and spent time with the Reverends Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy and other leaders of the civil rights movement. Baldwin told Painter about the emotional and physical strain of his travels, writing, quote, having reactions symptomatic of hysteria, barely controlled, always on the edge of tears, can't sleep, headaches. Next slide, please. Writing from the office of local newspaper, the Charlotte Israelite, Baldwin asked Painter to send a copy of his book, Notes of a Native Son, to Gus Roberts, one of 4 students then desegregating Charlotte high schools. Baldwin noted in the margin of his letter that from a population of around 50,000 Black people, only 45 applications were received to desegregate schools, a consequence of the threats and intimidation Black students and families faced after Brown versus Board of Education. Next slide, please. Baldwin wrote about Roberts and his mother in an essay, The Hard Kind of Courage, published in Harper's in 1958. He later changed the essay's title to Fly in the Buttermilk, the title by which it is known to most readers today. Baldwin also provided details of a failed school desegregation attempt after a Black student, Dorothy Counts, refused to return to her high school after suffering violent threats. Baldwin offers insight on ways social class, self-interest, and the cowardice of government leadership contributed to a silence that amounted to, quote, tacit consent to the mobs. Next slide. After having been, quote, badly frightened in Montgomery, Baldwin wrote from Tuskegee, where African Americans were engaged in a boycott of white-owned businesses, leaving shops empty or closed and rendering the city a ghost town. Staged in response to Local Act 140, state redistricting legislation that redrew Tuskegee boundaries to deprive Black citizens of their right to vote in city elections, the protest started in June. It would continue for more than a year. Referring to the desegregation of buses that followed the Birmingham bus boycott, Baldwin wrote that Alabama segregationists, quote, are not taking their defeat in the matter of the buses with anything like grace. They are compelled to keep trying, with what interior consequences only God can tell. And when the deal at last goes down, they will only have added blood to blood, end quote. The essay Baldwin wrote for the Partisan Review about this leg of his trip would become the title of his enduringly influential book, Nobody Knows My Name, published in 1961. Next slide, please. In the final section of the exhibition, Baldwin's travels in the South have left him depleted and depressed. After a few weeks in New York City, he withdrew to the MacDowell Colony, an artist's retreat in rural New Hampshire. MacDowell was a favorite place to write. Baldwin was tired, but in truth, he'd gone to MacDowell to work, not to rest. Another country was still unfinished, but now Baldwin was shifting focus. A theatrical production of his novel, Giovanni's Room, was in the works. A production of his play, The Amen Corner, was also in development, another script to write. Baldwin was troubled by relationships too, he told Painter, an argument with a friend, the still fresh grief of a recent breakup. Later, with the South still on his mind, Baldwin considered a painful, even hopeless tangle of love and work, happiness and grief, responsibility and expectation. Quote, "I don't think I have ever suffered before as I have in these last few months. I do not regret it. My choices were fearfully clear in spite of the fact that I did not want to know it." Finally, as the eventful year drew to a close, from the pine woods of New Hampshire, Baldwin found connections among love, passion, and art, writing, quote, "I am compelled to respect wherever I find it and in whatever guise or surrounded by whatever dangers, the sacred fire." Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank my co-curators, Melissa Barton and Nancy Kuhl, again for inviting me into this project, and to Mike Moran for giving me the opportunity to share with y'all all of the beautiful things I've come across in Ollie's world. Because folks seem to be least familiar with the work of Ollie Harrington, this talk will mostly serve as an introduction to him and his work. The exhibit, I think, mostly has to speak for itself. When I saw it after it was first installed, I was moved to tears, which admittedly is not uncommon for me, but I think the emotion of the exhibit is palpable, and I don't know how well I'd be able to recreate that for you here. My job here today is to coax you into the world of Ollie Harrington, but I'll only be giving you a little sample because the real deep dive is going to happen in another Mondays at Beinecke that's happening on April 22nd. Between this teaser and the curved cases in the exhibit, I think Ollie Harrington is going to leave the kind of impression on you that makes you want to attend yet another Zoom call. So hope to see you in April, and let's jump in. Oliver Wendell Harrington was born in 1912 on Valentine's Day in New York City, where he first learned to use art to channel and express his emotions after a racist encounter with a teacher in his high school in the Bronx. Building on a Black comic tradition carried by artists like Fawn Hawley and Henry Brown in the earliest 20th century, and Leslie Malcolm Rogers and Jim Watson in the 20s, Harrington launched his career in the early 1930s. But the inspiration that he actually names in his collection of essays titled Why I Left America are El Greco, Thomas Hart, and Milton Caniff. At the time, in the early 30s, Harrington was drawing illustrations for publications like the National News, the New York Amsterdam News, and he had a few assignments from the Pittsburgh Courier and the Baltimore Afro-American. Next slide, please. Backing up a bit, it was in the 1920s that African-American periodicals really embraced the appeal of and had the budget for a staff artist. So Harrington was really coming up right on time. His hit character Bootsy first appeared in his Amsterdam news strip Dark Laughter in 1935, and the series became one of the first nationally recognized comic strips by a Black artist. He took a steady job with the Pittsburgh Courier and launched the strip Jive Gray in 1943, which mostly had to do with Tuskegee Airmen. And between those monumental career moments, he graduated from the Yale School of Fine Arts with a BFA in 1940. And in addition to his career as a cartoonist, he went on a number of side quests, like serving as the Courier's war correspondent in parts of Northern Africa and Europe during World War II. And in 1946, he took up the task of forging a public relations department for the NAACP at the direct request of Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, whom Harrington met while doing work abroad for the Courier. Next slide, please. Harrington's time abroad had a huge impact on his work. As an expat, friends with other famous expats like Richard Wright, Harrington was able to bear witness to America at a distance. Like Douglass and Baldwin, Harrington spent time abroad that impacted his perspective. In the southern case of the exhibit, you can see examples of the ways Harrington was making connections between racism and classism in the US, and racism, classism, and imperialism in other parts of the world. During his time abroad, he was also given the chance to experiment with printing color comics for the first time. So when you walk through the exhibit and you see the pieces that are done with watercolor instead of pen, you can tell they're from the later years of his career. And I'm really hoping that people don't just look quickly at the images and immediately search for the caption. I'm hoping that people will linger and pay attention to the artistry and the technical skill it took to render that much detail and emotion in a single frame comic. Harrington was so impacted by his time abroad, and I think so disappointed with the state of things in the United States, that he made Europe his permanent home in the 50s, spending time in Paris and Berlin and making comics for periodicals like Eulenspiegel and Das Magazine. Those were unnecessary details for me to share right now, but I did want to say them out loud because they're fun. There was also some drama going on in his personal life in Paris, but you'll have to come back in April to hear about the cafe fight. I'm tantalizing you. That's what's happening. Next slide, please. Harrington expertly wielded the political power of comics, and he did not shy away from taking clear stances against the administration. It's clear from his work that he could not stand Ronald Reagan, and he was not afraid to show it. There's something about the form of the comic that is disarming at first, so he can really pack an emotional punch as you take a closer look and read the captions. You're drawn in by a beautiful blue watercolor image of flying birds, and then you're slapped with a joke about climate change. So you're laughing, but also sweating, and not just because of global warming, but because this is realistically how long we've been warned about a changing planet. And I think it's important to know that though Harrington was deeply concerned with the well-being and future of Black folks in the US, he was inclusive in his critiques, particularly of capitalism, which he saw as one of America's biggest problems. His career lasted so long that one of the images you can see displayed in the exhibit features a parody of a Macintosh computer, so he really saw it all. And that's why you'll see me talking about the gaze in one of the banners. There's been a lot of American humor delivered at the expense of Black people, who are so often the subject of someone else's comic or the butt of someone else's joke. But part of what's revolutionary to me about Harrington's work, and also the work of all of the men involved in this exhibit, is that he points the microscope at folks that really deserve the scrutiny. To me, his work is a reminder that Black folks are not these passive objects being observed for others' entertainment, but we see each other and we see others as well. That legacy carries on through Black comedians and comics like Aaron McGruder, who created the comic strip turned hit sitcom, The Boondocks. McGruder's career was almost cut short in the beginning because so many saw his work as too edgy, but in reality, McGruder was following in the footsteps of the artist activists that came before him. And considering how visual popular culture is these days, I don't see that wave dying down anytime soon. Next slide, please. For my final point, I just want to show you this cartoon that you can see on the screen, which is featured in the exhibit, and read you a passage from an address Harrington gave that's printed in his collection of essays. Originally, I was going to read you the image's caption, but I think you should see it for yourself. So instead, I'll just read this passage from the address, Where is the Justice, that he delivered in 1946. Quote, "We are not people who despair. We are people who, having lived on the edge of life, want simply to live life fully, to live life without barriers, to be all that we can be, and a little bit of what, like you, we hope to be." End quote. As you take in Harrington's work, let that message sink in. There are people all over the world who are just trying to live fully, to live without barriers, to be all they can be, and a little of what they hope to be. Maybe we can think about what we do to break down those barriers for others and help them live fully, and know that we still have time to see Harrington's vision for a more equitable world come to fruition if we try. There's so much of that revolutionary spirit all throughout the exhibition. There's so much power in just believing that things can be better. And you can see that power in the humanity of Douglass and of Baldwin so expertly presented to you by Melissa and Nancy. You can see it in the dedication of the Evanses to preserving and generously and freely sharing African-American literature, arts, history, and culture. I like to think you can see it everywhere you look in the exhibit, but most importantly, I think you'll take it with you when you leave. Next slide, please. If you can't come in person, know that 95 of Harrington's pieces now live in the Beinecke digital collection, so you can get to them from wherever you are. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you come see Douglass Baldwin Harrington for yourselves soon.
Hi again. I'm just going to say a final word on behalf of my co-curators, Melissa and Kassidi, and myself. When you come to the library, it can be hard to see how much work goes into producing our exhibitions. And so we've got this slide here just aiming to thank our many colleagues, both in and outside of the library, who have made a contribution to this show. We're so grateful to have so many wonderful collaborators. This is really a whole community's work, and we're really grateful to have been part of it and to have so many people involved. Thank you.